Oh, good morning, everyone. Today is a good day. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about how to deploy Azure Container Instance. I'm going to be walking us through how to create, configure, and deploy a Docker container to Azure Container Instances in the Azure portal. So, first of all, we know that if you want to deploy a container in your infrastructure, let's say you are running an on-premise infrastructure, you need to have a server where you will install your Docker runtime on so that you could be able to create containers and run those containers in your environment. Or maybe you want to use Microsoft infrastructure as a service whereby you create a virtual machine. On that same virtual machine, you also need to install the runtime so that it will enable you to create and manage your containers efficiently. But Microsoft Azure is offering you a managed service called Azure Container Instances, whereby you could spin up these containers. You don't need to care about managing the underlying infrastructure. Microsoft do all the job for you. Today, still on still, we're on the Azure portal, but I'm just going to walk us through how we could sign into Azure portal. Let's just go portal.azure.com and hit enter. It hooks us straight into the Azure portal. On the Azure portal here, we are going to see various services offered by Azure, such as virtual machines, app service, virtual machine skill set, Microsoft Sentinel, and lots more. But today, we are actually going to create Azure Container Instances. On my search under Search Resources, Services, and Doc, I'm going to search for Azure Container Container Instances. Yeah, I have it here. Azure Container Instances. I'm just going to click on it. Here I have no container instances created. I'm just going to go ahead to create one by clicking on create. Let's wait for the settings to show up. So we could just continue with our creation. Here under the project details, very important, you need a subscription to actually deploy any service on Azure, and resource group is important also, so you could group your resource in a good order. So here, I'm just going to select one of my resource group here, which is my web app RG. Let me just be using this my web app RG to deploy all my applications that I want to use, whether a web app or container app. Here, this brings me now to the container details. On the container details, I'll just call my own container Oyimafu. Let me see if the name has been taken. Yeah, okay. No one has used Oyimafu as a container name in Azure before. So I'll just go ahead to use it. Under the region, we have East US, but I would just like to select West Europe since it's closer to me here in Nigeria. The next setting is availability zone. Availability zone, you could decide to select how you want redundancy to happen in your container, but since this is a lab environment, I'll just go for none. Here now, we have the SKU. This SKU now determines the cost. So I'll just go for standard, and it's okay for me since it's just a lab environment. Yeah. Now this brings us to image sources. Under the image sources, we have quick starts. If we look at the image here, we have Microsoft Container Registry.microsoft.com, Azure Docs, ACI, Hello World, latest. This image now is actually a public image that we could get from Microsoft Container Registry. If I have some image in my own container registry, which maybe the image is in Azure Container Registry, I could just go to the registry, select the registry, then pick any of my images that I have in my Azure Container Registry. Or let's say you have the image in other registry. If it's in Docker, if it's in Docker Hub, we could see here that there is a amber sign. Please be aware that Docker Hub have recently introduced a pull rate limit on Docker images. When specifying an image from the Docker Hub registry, this may impact the creation of your container instances. Here as it is, you're already getting this warning sign of the pull rate limit on Docker images. So you have that at the back of your mind. All you just need to do is to put the link to your to the image that you want to pull from Docker, and you run the settings here. But in my own case, I would just like us to use a quick start image so that we'll just see the settings and how it looks like. Under the size, if we click on change size, we could also select other sizes that are available for Azure Container Instances. You could increase the vCPU either to from between 1 to 4, and you could also increase the memory from 1.5 to 16 depending on the use case. So in this case, I'll just leave the default and click OK. I will now go next to networking. This networking part actually interests me a lot because under the networking type, you have the options to make your container instance public. All I just need to do is to give it a public name. Let me say Oyimafu container. Yeah. Then it's going to ask me for DNS label scope view. So as it is, I'll just leave it at tenant. Then these are the settings for networking. If you want it to be private, once you select private, you need to create a virtual network if you are going for the private option. But we'll just use public. When the container is created, I'm going to explain the advantage of using public and how it could help us in our deployment and make our container accessible over the internet using our domain name if we have one hosted already. This brings us now to the ports. Under the port, we have port numbers whereby you can specify any of the port number you want to specify. If you want it to be, if you want the protocol to be TCP or UDP, you could just pick any of the two. You can just go next to net monitoring. Yeah, under monitoring here, it just enables you to use log analytic workspace to log queries from your container instances. But in this case, since it's actually a test environment, I will just say, okay, let me just uncheck this. But in a production environment, it's good we get logs to know what's happening in our container instances so that we can have faster response if there's any issue. I'll just uncheck enable log instances. I'll go to advanced. Under advanced, all these settings, restart policy, you could say always, never, on failure. So it's better the restart policy should be on failure so that anytime it fails, it should always restart. So we'll go to tags. If you want to tag your containers so that you could categorize them, that will be a use case for you. Yeah, we just go to review and create. So we create our container instances. We'll just wait for the final validation to run. Once it's run, we are just going to observe it. Now the validation has passed. First of all, before we click on create, it is good we look at the settings we have specified because once you create it, there are some settings that you cannot change. Here now, the subscription I picked was Virtual Studio Subscription Enterprise. That's my subscription. The resource group is my web app RG. The region is West Europe. The container name I specified was Oyemafu. The SKU standard image type public, which means I want my image to be accessible publicly. The image I'm specifying is Microsoft Container Registry .microsoft.com Azure Docs ACI Hello World latest. The OS type I'm using is Linux. I'm not using a Windows OS type, which we know you could deploy a container in both Linux and Windows environments. That is why Microsoft is giving you that offering to select any of the operating system that you want. Memory, I'm using 1.5 gig. Number of cores, 1. GPU type, none. GPU count, is also 0. Now we have networking type here. I made it public. Let's take, for instance, I was supposed to make it private. All I just need to do is to go back to previous and change the settings to private, whereby I will need to create my own virtual network so that for people to access my container instances, they have to be on that virtual network. And also, if I want to link my on-premise environment to my container instances, I could also do that using my virtual network using the virtual network I created by just establishing a point to site or site to site VPN between my local environment and my virtual network. We just do site to site so that my local network could communicate with my virtual network in Azure. Let's just go under the port I specified 80 TCP port. Now we have DNS name, which is Oyemafu container, and the tenant. Just go down and click on create. Just create. Let's wait for it to create. The deployment is in progress. Let's hold on while the deployment is in progress. Yeah, submitting deployment. Submitting deployment. We'll just be observing it while it creates to soon be done. Most times, if my deployment is ongoing, I would just like to click on the notification here so that I could get the update fast. I could get the update fast. So my deployment is ongoing. Deployment name Microsoft Container Instances. It has its own GUID, it is unique identifier. Subscription, Visual Studio Enterprise, Resource Group, My Web App RG. Start time 1st January 29, 2025. This is the time it's creating. Let's just wait for the deployment to complete so we can explore our container instances and see some settings that we could look at in the container overview and various settings. Let's just go. It's actually in progress. Just wait for it to, oh, wow, the deployment is complete. That's fast. Just comparing to when you want to actually do this locally in your environment, it takes much time before you do it. But in Microsoft Azure, it's actually very fast. You could just deploy your image immediately without stress. Now we have some settings here. Under the container instances, we have the overview where we have the SKU, which is standard, the OS type, which is Linux. Now we have the public IP. With this public IP address, you could access this website publicly. For us to access our container instances, let me just click on copy and go to the tab and paste that URL to see if I will access the container instance. Sometimes it might take a while to load. Okay, it's already telling me that the site is not secured, which is true because I've not actually installed a certificate to make it secured. So let me just click on continue to sites. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So I have my container instance here, which is welcoming me to Azure Container Instance. And I also welcome you all to Azure Container Instance also. So let's go next. There's another way we could access it again. We could access it using our public IP. Let me just copy the public IP and go to the next tab and paste it to see if we'll access. Yeah, it brings us to the same. Just click on continue. Now we have welcome to Azure Container Instances. So for this public IP, it could be used. Let's say you have a public domain where you are hosted in any of the DNS registry, such as GoDaddy. You could just take this public IP address and create an A record, mapping this public IP to your domain name, so that anytime users query your domain name, it maps them to this public IP. You could do that so that your users, instead of accessing your container with the public IP, they could just go with the domain name you specify and map to this public IP, and they will have access to your container instances. We have other settings here. If I click on settings, we have containers. This is where you view the container you have deployed. Here now the container name is Oyimafu and the image is mcr.microsoft.com. Let's say for instance I'm unsure of the image I specified. From here I could see the image name, which is microsoft.com Azure Doc ACI image, and the state is running. So we could see other settings under the event. We could see when the container started, which is today 7:42 a.m. We could see when the image was pulled from the registry. We could see the time the pulling started. Under the properties, we could see the properties. This is the image name. This is the source of the image, which is mcr microsoft.com Azure Docs, and this is the port vCPU and all. Then once we go to logs, we'll also see live logs happening on the container, how everything is going on, the running state and all. The next thing will can equally connect. You could connect to this container either using Beam Bash or any of these scripts. You could just use go for custom depending on what you want to do. Let's go to identity. Yeah, yeah. Container also supports system assign manage identity, and it's also support user manage identity, but it's also in premium. So we are going to talk about this on a later class. Yeah, let's go to properties. Let's see what we have in properties. Properties just shows you the properties of the container instance, the OS type, the public IP, the SKU, and the DNS name, scope for reuse. It shows you basically all the settings you need in your container environments, managing your container instances. Yeah, thank you very much for joining me today. Let me do a recap of what we have done. Today, we talked about Azure Container Instances and how it's a managed services by Azure. Microsoft Azure is managing these container instances for you. Imagine you want to deploy container instance in your local environment. First of all, you need to have a server, you need to install the operating system. After installing the operating system, you need to also install a runtime in that operating system whereby you could be able to create container image, pull container image, and even run container images, right? And also, if you want to use infrastructure, Microsoft infrastructure as a service, whereby you actually create a virtual machine in Azure, you still do the same thing. Microsoft will only help you with managing the hardware. Instead of you to have your own local hardware, Microsoft will now help you manage that hardware, but you'll still be the one that will create the container runtime yourself and manage the underlying infrastructure of the container by yourself. But with Microsoft Container Instances, you don't need to do all that because Microsoft is giving you their platform. Container Instance is a platform as a service offering by Microsoft to help you manage your containers instead of you to be going through all the stress in managing it yourself. Now, that's what we did today, talking about container instances and which we deployed a container instance from Azure and we're able to access it using the public IP and also using the DNS name. Thank you very much for joining me. Please do well to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos, and I'll be dropping videos back to back so we could get our hands dirty on Microsoft Azure and the use case. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I appreciate